A young pregnant woman is dead, and her boyfriend is now facing manslaughter charges after he allegedly shot her. Lemmarra Bradshaw, 18, was allegedly shot and killed by Robert Tatum in Philadelphia on March 9th. She was pregnant with her second baby, 6 ABC Philadelphia and Law and Crime reported. Tatum, 29, claimed that Bradshaw came at him with a knife and a screwdriver when he allegedly shot her, according to the outlets. He now faces charges of voluntary manslaughter, possessing an instrument of crime with intent, and recklessly endangering another person, court records show. Bradshaw leaves behind a 4-year-old daughter. There is a specific kind of peace found in a home where a young child plays. A scent of laundry detergent and perhaps the faint, sweet aroma of a snack being prepared. And it was in this environment that Lemmarra moved with the grace of someone who carried the future within her. She was pregnant, her body a vessel for a second life that would never get the chance to see the Philadelphia skyline or feel the touch of a grandmother's hand. We often look at 18 as an age of transition, a bridge between the dreams of childhood and the responsibilities of the world. But for Lemmarra, that bridge was already heavily laden with the profound duties of a parent. To her family, she was a light that refused to be dimmed, a daughter and a niece whose presence filled a room with a soft, persistent energy. Her mother, Michelle Adekola, looked at her daughter and saw the reflection of her own hopes. A young woman trying to navigate the complexities of love and partnership while holding the hand of a toddler. At the time, the world inside their home was focused on the simplest of things, the kind of domestic anchors that keep us grounded. There was a new addition to the household, a small hamster that Michelle had bought for her granddaughter, a tiny creature meant to bring a sense of wonder and responsibility to a 4-year-old's life. It is a detail so ordinary, so quintessentially human, that it makes the events to follow feel all the more distant from the logic of a peaceful night. This small pet was a gift of love, a symbol of the gentle cycles of care that Lemmarra sought to cultivate for her child. However, beneath this surface of domesticity, a different kind of energy was simmering, one that would later be described by those who knew the family as a pattern of volatility and shadow. Lemmarra was in a relationship with 29-year-old Robert Tatum, a man whose presence in her life had become a source of increasing concern for those who loved her. According to family members, the relationship was not the sanctuary it should have been. Instead, it was a space where jealousy and manipulation had begun to take root like weeds in a garden. Her aunt would later recall a chilling incident from just 2 weeks prior, a moment of physical violence where a punch was thrown, a sign of a brewing storm that Lemmarra, in her youth and perhaps her hope for a unified family, tried to weather by returning to him within 24 hours. By the next morning, the name Lemmarra Bradshaw would no longer be spoken in the present tense by the news cycles, but her story would begin to unfold as a testament to a void that could never be filled. The investigation would eventually reveal that on that March night, the air inside the home was thick with an argument, a clash of words that some say centered on the hamster, while others suggested the deeper, more corrosive sting of infidelity. It was a confrontation that escalated far beyond the boundaries of a simple disagreement, ending in the sound of a gunshot that pierced the quiet of the Philadelphia night. The police report would identify Robert Tatum as the one who pulled the trigger, claiming later that he had been acting in fear, alleging that Lemmarra had approached him with a knife and a screwdriver. Yet, the tragedy remains that an 18-year-old girl carrying a child was lost to a moment of ultimate finality. The investigation moved with a heavy, procedural, deliberate pace, leading to Tatum's arrest and charges of voluntary manslaughter, possessing an instrument of crime, and recklessly endangering another person. As we look back at that night, the tragedy is not just in the violence, but in the silence of the toys left on the floor and the 4-year-old girl who would grow up with only the fading echoes of her mother's voice. The impossible choice, often referred to by those observing from the outside, is the struggle of a young woman caught between the hope of a relationship and the instinct for survival, a choice that Lemmarra was forced to navigate until her time ran out. The family now speaks of a deep and painful void, a heavy stillness that resides where a vibrant young woman once stood. We find ourselves reflecting on the fragility of these lives, recognizing that the safety we feel is often a gift we must never take for granted. As the legal process moves forward, the memory of Lemmarra and her unborn baby remains a soft, somber light in the hearts of those she left behind, a reminder of a tomorrow that was promised but never arrived. Hello everyone, and welcome back. I know many of you join me here as you prepare for sleep, seeking a place where the world feels a little smaller and more manageable. Tonight, as the rain settles over the streets of Philadelphia, we gather to remember a life taken too soon. The evening of March 9th carried the specific heavy scent of a city in transition, the smell of damp pavement mixing with the lingering chill of a winter that refused to fully retreat. Outside, the world is muted. The rhythmic thrum of windshield wipers provides a steady, hypnotic cadence against the glass, a heartbeat for a city that is slowly winding down. Tonight, we do not focus on the noise of the headlines, but on the quiet life of Lemmarra Bradshaw, a mother, a daughter, and a soul whose story deserves to be heard in the stillness of the night. As the rain falls, we let the external world fade away, focusing only on the soft light of a memory. In the heart of the city, amongst the rows of brick and stone, there are thousands of stories unfolding, most of them quiet, most of them filled with the simple hope of a tomorrow that looks much like today. Philadelphia in early March is a place of flickering amber streetlights and long shadows that stretch across residential porches. It is a landscape defined by the intersection of a grand, sweeping history and the intimate modern lives of the people who call these neighborhoods home. There is a certain comfort in the familiarity of these streets, where the sound of a distant siren or the hum of a passing car becomes part of the evening's natural white noise. We think of home as a sanctuary, a place where the doors are locked against the cold and the lights are kept low to invite rest. It is the destination we all seek at the end of a long day, the place where we are permitted to be our truest selves. For Lemmarra, an 18-year-old girl navigating the beautiful, complex terrain of young motherhood, home was where her 4-year-old daughter played, and where the dreams of a second child were beginning to take shape. The air in these neighborhoods often carries the faint aroma of wood smoke or the steam from kitchen vents, small sensory anchors that remind us of the domestic peace we strive to protect. In the stillness of this rainy March night, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a story that reminds us how fragile that peace can be, and how important it is to hold space for those whose quiet lives were interrupted by a storm they did not create. We settle into this space together, protected by the distance of time and the safety of our own surroundings, to honor a narrative that began with the same simple hopes we all carry into the dark. To understand the girl Lemmarra Bradshaw was, we must look at the small, quiet anchors of her daily life in Philadelphia, far away from the heavy headlines that would later define her name. At 18, she was a young woman standing on the delicate bridge between her own childhood and the immense responsibility of motherhood. Those who knew her best remember a person who moved through the world with a gentle, persistent kindness, a quality that seemed to radiate from her, even when the city around her felt loud and different. She was a daughter who still sought her mother's counsel, a friend who listened more than she spoke, and above all, a mother whose world revolved around the laughter of her 4-year-old daughter. In the weeks leading up to that quiet March evening, Lemmarra's life was filled with the soft, domestic preparations that come with expecting a second child. There is a specific kind of stillness in a home where a nursery is being imagined, a sense of anticipation that hangs in the air like the scent of fresh linen. She spent her days navigating the balance of caring for her young daughter while preparing her heart for the new life growing within her. Her family recalls her as being deeply devoted, the kind of mother who found joy in the smallest milestones, ensuring her little girl felt safe and cherished. This devotion was evident in the simple gifts they shared, like the small hamster her mother, Michelle Adekola, had recently bought for the 4-year-old. A tiny, flickering spark of joy meant to teach the child about gentleness and care. Yet behind this facade of maternal peace, there was a growing shadow that Lemmarra's family watched with increasing concern. They describe a young woman who was perhaps too loyal, someone whose capacity for love was occasionally used against her. Her relationship with Robert Tatum, a man 11 years her senior, was not the sanctuary it should have been. Her aunt would later reflect on the manipulation that seemed to weave through their interactions, noting how Lemmarra often returned to him even after moments of clarity or conflict. It was a cycle of hope and disappointment that many families recognize too late. A quiet struggle played out in the private corners of a shared life. As we look closer at the portrait of her final days, we see a young woman trying to maintain her footing in a world that was becoming increasingly volatile. The investigation would eventually peel back the layers of their relationship. But for those who loved her, the focus remained on the light she brought into a room. She was someone who deserved a long, unfolding future, one filled with the mundane beauty of school runs, birthday parties, and the simple act of watching her children grow. Instead, her story becomes a reflective study on the vulnerability of the heart. By the time the seasons began to shift toward spring, the vibrant life Lemmarra was building was nearing an end she could never have foreseen, leaving her family to hold on to the echoes of her voice and the memory of a smile that once promised so much more. The investigation would later detail the specific tensions of that night. But in this moment, we simply sit with the memory of who she was before the world knew her as a statistic. She was a sister, a niece, and a mother who believed in the possibility of a peaceful home. As the clock continued its steady march toward midnight, the small, everyday sounds of her household, the rustle of a pet in its cage, the breathing of a sleeping child, formed the backdrop of a life that was, in every sense, precious and irreplaceable. The essence of an 18-year-old is often defined by a sense of infinite beginning, a time when the world feels expansive and the future remains a series of unwritten pages. For Lemmarra Bradshaw, this threshold of adulthood was not merely about her own aspirations, but about the profound weight of the life she had already created. At 18, while many of her peers were navigating the simple anxieties of school or the tentative steps of first jobs, Lemmarra was already the anchor for another human being. To look at her was to see the soft features of a teenager merged with the steady, protective gaze of a mother. She moved through the world with a quiet resilience, her youth providing a vibrant energy that she poured entirely into the upbringing of her 4-year-old daughter. This little girl was the center of Lemmarra's universe, a mirror image of her own spirit, and the primary reason she sought to build a sanctuary within the walls of their home. The bond between them was a tapestry of small, gentle moments that rarely make it into the cold print of a police report. It was found in the way Lemmarra would patiently braid her daughter's hair, or the soft, melodic tone she used to read bedtime stories as the Philadelphia evening settled outside their windows. To her daughter, Lemmarra wasn't just a name in a news report. She was the hand that held hers, the voice that sang her to sleep, and the entire world wrapped in a single person. This relationship was the primary engine of Lemmarra's existence, a role that brought her both a sense of profound purpose and a constant, quiet exhaustion that she bore with a smile. She was a mother who understood that the smallest actions, a warm meal, a shared laugh, or a reassuring touch, were the bricks and mortar of a child's sense of safety. The promise of their small family was poised to expand even further as the news of Lemmarra's second pregnancy began to circulate. This was not just another life. It was the potential for a deeper sense of belonging and a new chapter in the history of a young woman who was fiercely committed to her children. The idea of her 4-year-old becoming an older sister brought a fresh layer of hope to the household. It was a promise of shared secrets in the dark and the laughter of 2 children echoing through the hallways. For Lemmarra, this second pregnancy represented an expansion of her capacity to love, a broadening of the horizon she was working so hard to secure. There is a particular kind of bittersweetness in witnessing an 18-year-old mother navigating the complexities of her world. She was still a girl in so many ways, yet her shoulders carried the responsibilities of a seasoned adult. The news of the second child was a beacon, a signal that despite the challenges she faced, she was building something lasting and meaningful. It was within this context of burgeoning life and maternal devotion that the events of the evening began to unfold. The presence of the hamster, a simple gift from Lemmarra's mother for the 4-year-old girl, was meant to be a small source of joy, a tiny life to be nurtured alongside their own. As we consider the tragic turn that would soon follow, it is essential to hold this image of Lemmarra in our minds, not as a victim defined by her end, but as a young mother who saw only the future in her children's eyes. The transition from the hopeful anticipation of a growing family to the quiet, persistent tension of the household was not a sudden break, but a gradual deepening of the shadows that lined the hallways of Lemmarra's life. At 29, Robert Tatum occupied a significantly different stage of life than 18-year-old Lemmarra, creating a gap that was measured in more than just years. While she was still navigating the threshold of adulthood, balancing the needs of her 4-year-old daughter with the dreams of a teenager, Robert moved with the weight of a decade more experience. Experience that, according to those who knew them, was often weaponized through the subtle, sharp edges of control. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the city noise of Philadelphia faded into a dull hum, the dynamics of their relationship often shifted from the warmth of shared domesticity to a cold, underlying friction. It is here that we encounter the companion effect, a psychological phenomenon where the closeness of shared space and physical intimacy creates a veil, softening the jagged edges of a partner's behavior until the red flags seen by the outside world appear merely as shadows to those within. To her family, the warnings were as bright as a summer sun, but to Lemmarra, they were perhaps just the weather she had learned to live with. Her aunt would later recall a harrowing incident occurring just 2 weeks before the final tragedy, a moment of physical violence where Robert reportedly struck Lemmarra in the face. It was a clear, unmistakable signal of escalating danger. Yet the gravity of the act was quickly smothered by a cycle of manipulation. Within 24 hours, Lemmarra had returned to him, drawn back by the gravity of a familiar routine and the persuasive promises of change that so often follow an outburst of rage. This cycle is a labyrinthine path, one where the walls are built from a mixture of fear, hope, and the biological tie of a child, both present and expected. In the eyes of her loved ones, Robert was a man prone to jealous rages, a person who viewed Lemmarra's world through a lens of suspicion rather than support. They saw the strings of manipulation being pulled, observing how he could pivot from aggression to a facade of remorse in the time it takes for a candle to flicker out. Love is often a labyrinth, and for Lemmarra, the path back to what felt familiar was paved with promises that the shadows would eventually fade, even as they grew longer with every passing day. We must consider the quiet moments in that Philadelphia home, the sound of a kettle whistling, the sight of a child's toys scattered on the rug, and how those mundane anchors can make a person feel anchored to a situation that is slowly drifting toward a waterfall. The familiarity of a shared bed and the scent of a partner's clothing can act as a powerful sedative against the instinct to flee. While her mother, Michelle, watched from the periphery with a growing sense of unease, Lemmarra was living inside the storm, where the wind feels less violent than it looks from the window. The manipulation described by her family suggests a deliberate narrowing of her world, a process where the shadows in the hallway became the only landscape she was permitted to navigate. As the clock ticked toward the night of March 9th, the air in the house grew heavy, not with the silence of peace, but with the held breath of a conflict, waiting for a reason to ignite. The interior of the Philadelphia home on March 9th was a landscape of domesticity, where the artifacts of a young life were scattered across the floor, illuminated by the soft, filtered light of the afternoon. In the corner of the room sat a small plastic habitat, a gift recently arrived from Lemmarra's mother, Michelle Adekola. Inside, a tiny hamster, intended as a source of wonder for Lemmarra's 4-year-old daughter, moved through the wood shavings with a quiet, rhythmic persistence. The creature was a symbol of grandmotherly affection, a small living thing meant to teach a child about gentleness and the quiet joys of responsibility. As the clock moved toward the late afternoon hours, the sound of the hamster's wheel began to spin, a high-pitched, metallic whirring that filled the spaces between the increasingly tense words exchanged by the adults in the room. There is a profound, unsettling stillness that often precedes a break in the domestic peace, a moment where the air feels too thick to breathe. In this house, that stillness was shattered by a disagreement so remarkably mundane that it defies the gravity of what was to follow. Robert Tatum and Lemmarra began to argue over the pet, the small cage becoming a flashpoint for frustrations that had likely been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. To an outsider, the sight of two adults raising their voices over a small rodent and its plastic home would seem almost absurd. Yet within the walls of that relationship, the hamster was no longer just a gift. It had become a proxy for control, a tiny, innocent catalyst for a much larger, more volatile storm of emotion. The investigation would later grapple with the conflicting narratives of how this afternoon truly unfolded. While the initial trigger appeared to be the dispute over the child's new pet, a darker, more complex theory emerged from those who knew the couple best. Lemmarra's aunt would later suggest that the hamster was merely the surface-level excuse, a convenient anchor for a deeper, more agonizing conflict involving allegations of Robert's infidelity. In this version of the afternoon, the air was not just heavy with the sound of a spinning exercise wheel, but with the suffocating weight of betrayal and the desperate circular arguments of a young woman trying to find her footing in a relationship defined by a jealous rage. We can almost see the scene as it stood before the escalation reached its peak. The small, colorful cage sitting on a table, the water bottle dripping a single, rhythmic bead into the bedding, and the 4-year-old daughter perhaps watching, confused by how a gift meant for her had become the center of such vitriol. The wheel continued to spin, round and round, much like the arguments that led nowhere, creating a hypnotic, mechanical drone that masked the true danger of the moment. It is a cruel irony of life that the most violent storms can be sparked by the smallest, most innocent of gestures. What was meant to be a lesson in care, and life was instead becoming the backdrop for a tragedy that would soon leave a family broken and a young life extinguished. By 5 p.m., the atmosphere in the Philadelphia house had shifted from the mere friction of an argument into something far more jagged and unpredictable. The mundane details of the home, the scent of laundry, the hum of the refrigerator, the presence of the small pet, remained unchanged. But the spirit of the space had been compromised. The arguments did not settle. They merely shifted shape, gathering a momentum that felt as inevitable as the setting sun. As the evening shadows began to stretch across the floorboards, reaching toward the small plastic cage in the corner, the distance between a domestic dispute and a life-altering act of violence was rapidly, silently disappearing. The clock on the wall continued its steady, rhythmic pulse, a sound that usually brings a sense of order to a home. Yet on this evening in Philadelphia, it served only to measure the narrowing window of peace. As the hour approached, 9 o'clock, the atmosphere within the house had become heavy, the air thick with the kind of tension that precedes a summer storm. In these moments, the ordinary details of domestic life, a half-finished glass of water, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the lingering scent of a home-cooked meal, became the silent witnesses to an unfolding tragedy. The dispute, which had simmered through the late afternoon, finally reached its breaking point. Robert Tatum would later provide a specific narrative to the investigators who arrived in the wake of the violence. He claimed that the situation had shifted from a verbal altercation into a physical threat, alleging that Lemmarra had approached him while brandishing a knife and a screwdriver. In his account, the act of discharging a firearm was framed as a necessity of self-defense, a reactive measure taken in a moment of perceived peril. However, the physical reality of the scene told a story that was far more stark and final. While the legal system would eventually weigh the validity of his claims against the forensic evidence, the immediate consequence was immutable. An 18-year-old woman, carrying the promise of a second life within her, had been shot inside the very walls meant to provide her sanctuary. The sound of the shot was a sharp, definitive punctuation mark that ended the argument and began a different kind of silence, one that was soon filled by the mechanical urgency of the city's emergency response. Outside, the Philadelphia streets were slick with a light evening rain, the pavement turning into a dark, reflective mirror. Soon, that mirror was fractured by the rhythmic, alternating pulses of red and blue light. The police cruisers arrived with a quiet efficiency, their tires splashing through the puddles as they came to a halt. The strobing lights bounced off the brickwork of the neighboring houses and caught the glint of the wet asphalt, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach toward the front door. Officers stepped out into the damp air, their boots clicking against the ground as they moved toward the residence. In the clinical language of a police report, the vibrance of a life is often reduced to timestamps and evidence markers. What was once a home filled with the sounds of a 4-year-old's laughter and the quiet dreams of a young mother was now a designated crime scene, cordoned off by yellow tape that fluttered slightly in the cool breeze. The investigators began their methodical work, cataloging the position of the casings, the trajectory of the lead, and the presence of the tools Tatum claimed were used against him. Every detail was recorded with a detached precision, a necessary part of the process that nonetheless stood in haunting contrast to the warmth of the life that had just been extinguished. As the night deepened, the flashing lights continued to sweep across the neighborhood, a silent signal to the world that something irreparable had occurred behind those closed doors. The 29-year-old was taken into custody as the rain continued to fall, leaving the house to sit in a new, heavy stillness. The hamster cage remained in its corner, a small, mundane object that had sparked a fire far larger than anyone could have anticipated. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, the investigation had already begun to move from the chaotic reality of the room to the sterile environment of a case file, where Lemmarra Bradshaw's story would be preserved in the cold, unyielding ink of official records. The weight of that gray dawn did not merely settle on the cold ink of police reports. It pressed most heavily upon a small home in Philadelphia, where Michelle Adekola waited for a daughter who would never walk through the door again. To lose a child is to lose a piece of one's own future, a severance of the natural order that leaves the soul adrift. Yet Michelle was forced to navigate a grief that was compounded, layered, and jagged. She was not only mourning the vibrant 18-year-old she had raised, but also the grandchild who was still a promise, a life that ended before it could ever take its first breath. In the quiet moments following the notification, the house seemed to expand with a sudden, suffocating stillness, as if the very walls were absorbing the shock of Lemmarra's absence. Michelle would later speak of a haunting sensation, one that many parents who have faced the unthinkable will recognize: the protector's burden. It is the reflexive, agonizing belief that a mother's presence should be an impenetrable barrier against the world's cruelty. "I feel like I didn't protect her enough," Michelle would say, her voice carrying the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. "I wasn't there to help her. It makes me feel broken inside." This confession was not a failure of character, but a testament to a love that had always been a shield. A mother's love is a shield, but when the shield is not there, the weight of the aftermath is a burden no heart is designed to carry. It was as if she were trying to reach back through time, through the shadows of March 9th, to stand between her daughter and the violence that had claimed her. The investigation moved forward with its clinical, methodical precision, but inside the family home, time had essentially stopped. The void that Lemmarra left behind was not an abstract concept. It was a physical, tangible presence that could be felt in every corner of the house. There was a specific, hollowing pain in realizing that the crib, once intended for a new life, would remain unassembled, and the tiny clothes would never be worn. We find that in the wake of such a tragedy, the most mundane objects become the most painful reminders. The kitchen table, once a place of laughter and shared meals, now featured the empty chair, a visual echo of the daughter and grandchild who would no longer take their seats. This chair was a silent witness to the grief of a grandmother who now had to find the strength to explain the inexplicable to a 4-year-old girl who was wondering why her mother hadn't come home. The silence of the night remained unbroken by the sounds of Lemmarra's laughter, replaced instead by the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to mark the seconds of a life that was far too short. By the next morning, the reality of the loss had settled into a deep, heavy stillness. The community began to gather, but for Michelle, the world had shrunk to the size of her daughter's memory, a space where the warmth of tea and the smell of old family photographs provided the only small, fleeting comforts against an immense, cold horizon of grief. As the winter air of early March held its steady, biting chill over the streets of Philadelphia, the focus of this tragedy shifted from the warmth of a family home to the sterile, echoing corridors of the Justice Center. The transition from private grief to public record is often a jarring one, marked by the clicking of handcuffs and the heavy thud of courthouse doors. For Robert Tatum, the quiet of the night was replaced by the rigid structure of the legal system, a framework designed to hold the weight of actions that can never be undone. The investigation moved with a methodical, deliberate pace as detectives compiled the evidence of that final, fatal argument over a small pet and a fractured relationship. The legal weight brought against him was substantial, reflecting the gravity of the lives lost. He was formally charged with voluntary manslaughter, a designation that speaks to a killing committed in the heat of passion or under a sudden and intense provocation. Alongside this, the state leveled charges of possessing an instrument of crime with intent and recklessly endangering another person. These words, written in the sharp black ink of a police report, stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, messy, and hopeful life Lemmarra had been living just days prior. On March 11th, the world outside may have continued its frantic pace, but inside the courtroom for the preliminary arraignment, time seemed to stretch and thin. It was here that the transition from a person to a defendant became official. The judicial process is often described as a machine, but it is perhaps more accurate to see it as a ledger, slowly and painfully attempting to balance the scales. The March 11th appearance was merely the first step in a long, arduous journey toward an uncertain horizon. Following this initial appearance, a preliminary hearing was set for March 30th, a date that loomed on the calendar of the grieving family like a distant storm. In the intervening weeks, the most prominent image of the case became the official mugshot of Robert Tatum. This photograph, captured in the harsh, unflattering glow of a precinct light, serves as a cold record of a single moment in time. It is a flat, two-dimensional shadow of a man, devoid of the context of the domestic life he had shared with Lemmarra. To the public, it was a face on a news screen. To the family, it was a painful reminder of the individual who had been welcomed into their circle, only to shatter it from within. While the family clutched at warm memories, the sound of Lemmarra's laughter, the specific way she cared for her 4-year-old daughter, and the soft anticipation of the new baby. The legal system required only facts, dates, and evidence. This dichotomy between the heart's memory and the court's record is where the true weight of a trial resides. Justice is a slow-moving river, carving its path through the landscape of grief, seeking a sea where the truth can finally rest. It does not provide the immediate comfort of a hug or the resolution of a returned life, but it offers a steady, rhythmic progression toward a formal acknowledgement of what was taken. As the calendar turned toward late March, the community watched the legal proceedings with a heavy, quiet attention. There was no urgency in the court's movements, only the persistence of procedure. The paperwork was filed, the evidence was logged, and the lawyers prepared their arguments in rooms filled with the scent of old paper and the hum of distant traffic. In these moments of procedural stillness, the focus remained on the accountability that the law demands, ensuring that the silence of the night is eventually answered by the clarity of a verdict. The upcoming hearing promised a deeper dive into the events of that evening, a dissection of the claims of self-defense involving a knife and a screwdriver against the reality of a life cut short. But for now, the system held Robert Tatum in its grasp, moving him through the necessary phases of the American judiciary. It was a time of waiting, a time where the heavy machinery of the law worked in the background, while a family sat in the quiet of their living room, looking at an empty chair and a 4-year-old child who still expected her mother to walk through the door. Beyond the courtroom walls, the city of Philadelphia began to see the very first hints of a distant spring, though the ground remained hard and unforgiving. The legal process would continue long after the snow melted, a reminder that while the seasons change with a predictable grace, the healing of a broken heart follows no such schedule. Beyond the cold terminology of court dockets and the procedural motions of a preliminary hearing, there is a quieter, more profound weight that settled over North Philadelphia. It is the weight of a double absence. When the family finally spoke through the digital window of their GoFundMe page, the words they chose were not ones of vengeance or legal strategy, but of a specific, hollowed-out grief. They wrote that the loss of both Lemmarra and her unborn baby had devastated their family and their community. This was not a single life extinguished, but a branch of a family tree that had been pruned before it could ever truly bloom. We often measure tragedy by the milestones a person had already reached, but there is a different kind of mourning reserved for the milestones that were still only silhouettes on the horizon. There were tiny clothes that would never be worn, a name that might have been whispered in a nursery that would now remain silent, and a heartbeat that was stopped before it could ever be heard by the outside world. This second loss amplified the tragedy, turning a senseless act of violence into a generational theft. The family's statement described it as an unimaginable loss, a phrase that feels less like a description and more like a surrender to the scale of the void left behind. Within the walls of their home, the impact of this dual loss is felt most acutely in the presence of a 4-year-old girl. She is a child who now navigates a world where the two people she was meant to grow up beside, her mother and her sibling, have vanished into the soft periphery of memory and what might have been. We consider the quiet moments of the future, the birthdays where a younger brother or sister should have been blowing out candles, the first days of school where a mother should have been steadying a backpack, and the long summer evenings that should have been filled with the laughter of 2 children instead of the solitary play of one. The neighborhood of North Philadelphia, often seen through the lens of its struggles, felt this ripple deeply. It was a community in mourning for a promise. Neighbors spoke of the heavy stillness that seemed to hang over the street, a collective breath held in honor of a life that was tucked away, waiting for a spring it would never see. We mourn not just the life that was lived, but the potential of the life that was tucked away, waiting for a spring it would never see. The tragedy lies in the permanence of the absence, the way the world simply continues to turn while a family is left to count the empty chairs at their table. As the days stretched into weeks, the focus shifted from the loud chaos of the night in March to the long, quiet work of remembering.